5 Simsbury residents were recently recognized at the first 60 over 60 Connecticut Awards. These awards, created by Duncaster, honor Connecticut citizens over the age of 60 who continue to make a difference in the lives of others or in their communities. This is the first year the awards were presented. Duncaster began their search for 60 individuals who are making a difference in our community in January. They received nominations from business associates, family and friends, and people who admire the accomplishments of those in their communities. Among those chosen for the first class of 60 over 60 Connecticut were people who dedicated their lives to public service, authors, artists and poets, volunteers, caregivers, healthcare professionals, and executives with some of the state's most influential institutions. Those chosen are pioneers and change makers. They broke rules. They made new ones. They did things first and they kick-started change. They made history and they honored it. The recipients came from 25 towns across the state. With us today is one of those people, Simsbury resident and poet laureate Rennie McQuilkin. Welcome, Rennie. You are a poet laureate from both Connecticut and the town of Simsbury.
That's true.
What does a poet laureate do?
Breaks rules.
For a living? You break the rules for a living?
Well, I get very busy. I actually have a series at this station called Speaking of Poetry, since people are a little afraid of it.
Yes, I would be afraid of it.
I have
agree.
a column in the Hartford Courant that comes out once a month. I go to schools, I give readings, I help the young, and I publish Connecticut Poets.
You also are a publisher of Connecticut
That's
Poets.
one of my other hats.
Tell us a little bit about poetry. Can be very unnerving. It can be a little frightening, but I'm hearing that yours is pretty popular. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think poetry should be understandable for starters. I mean, I don't like schlock. I don't like Hallmark greetings. But I think that although you may be a little mystified the first time through, it ought to speak somewhat clearly and perhaps reveal more of itself as you read more. The best poetry you go back to over and over, like the Bible, because it keeps growing as you read it more. But for starters, I mean, I write the kind of poetry that people understand. And I think that's half the battle. Because people hate it because it makes them feel dumb. And it makes them feel dumb because probably the poet didn't take the time to be to have the gift of simplicity. Tis a gift to be simple. The gift
of simplicity, I like that.
The old Shaker saying. And so, and then beyond that, I see poetry as art. That is to say, it should present images. It shouldn't tell you what to think. It should give you the images, the reality, the events.
Sort of get you involved.
Leave some space between the lines for the reader to become involved. Not too much space. It's like gapping a spark plug. Too wide and there's no spark.
There's no spark.
Too narrow and it's too hot. So I like cool poetry that is that creates energy where there is a spark between the poem or between me and the reader.
You chose poetry, I assume, at an early age. Do you remember why?
I do.
Good.
Other than the fact that Mrs. Wood in the 6th grade put a poem of mine up on the board.
She started it all.
She started it all. We go back usually to some very influential teacher. I think that, and the teacher may be our mother or father or uncle or aunt or whatever, but in this case it was Mrs. Wood. But then I harbored the thought that poetry might be interesting. And when I became seriously diminished by all my brothers and father who were musicians and at Christmas time would, go into musical frenzies. And I would sit there, like the bump on the log. One Christmas I decided, well, all right, I'll write a poem.
And you were how old?
I suppose I was 11 or 12 at that point.
And you said, I'm going to be different, I'm going to write a poem?
I'm going to be a part of this. I'm not going to be totally upstaged. So I did, and I read it, and people went, and so that
was your first
seemed
success.
like a good thing.
Excellent. So what inspires you?
Well, I think this area, the
local
valley
area.
that used to be Lake 10,000 years ago, a deep lake between the two ridges on either side of Simsbury, is a fascinating place geologically and environmentally. And the Indian civilization here, we live on a farm where there are lots of Indian artifacts that crop up. So the land, the area, the Indian background, the mountain, essentially, or Talcott Mountain,
yes,
the old Appalachian remnant of a mountain, is inspiring. And that's one thing. Artwork is something else I write a lot about, but try to go beyond. Let the artwork be the origin of the poem, but not the reason for the poem. And if the artwork disappears in the end, fine. But let it be a catalyst, because art is an experience. It's not.
Right.
It's not separate from reality or real life. It is the essence of real life. Sometimes, and more intense.
Why don't you read us a couple poems? Show us.
I could do that.
You could do that. I had complete faith that you would be able to.
Just happened to.
You just happen to have a book right there.
This
okay.
is my newest book. It's called North of Eden.
North of Eden.
Which is where Adam and Eve wake up and go to work, fully dressed. So, well, I marked two. The first one, and I won't read them both, or at least not now. But the first one is based on artwork. The painting I saw at the Whitney in New York grabbed a hold of me immediately because it was so unlikely. It was a farmyard. Unlikely. It was a farmyard scene with a windmill and some Model A's and a big water trough in the middle. And in the middle of the water trough was a powerful-looking man who was standing in the water, had his two hands on the shoulders of a young woman in a white gown. And I thought to myself, she's not a cow. This is not going to be, cattle drinking out of a water trough.
Yes.
And I think I knew, but I didn't want to say it to myself until I looked at the caption, and the title of the painting is Baptism in Kansas. It was going to be baptism by total immersion.
Right.
You get totally pushed under the water
right.
in a cattle tank. So I thought, well, that's interesting. That's something I've got to think about, write about. I made some notes about the colors and,
So you see the art first and you might write down your impressions and then later come back to it.
I had a feeling I'm going to do something. I didn't have any idea, nor did I have any idea how it would end, which they say is a good thing. If you know how a piece is going to end, then it doesn't do something that surprises everyone, including you. Right. So it's called Baptism, after Baptism in Kansas by John Stuart Curry, who was a member of the American Gothic school.
Yep.
It's kind of, I would call it magic realism, but it's kind of, American Gothic realism. Baptism. Things keep going on the way they do, except that one day in the middle of nothing, they don't. I remember how hot it was, not a creak from the windmill, and the Fords our folks had come in steamed. We stood around. Our pockets were no place for hands, they said, and wouldn't let us in the dark of the barn or anywhere God wouldn't be, because the preacher was in the yard to baptize whoever he could in Tatum's water tank. 6 lined up. I envied them the cool of their gowns and the year or so they had on me, but not the way he dragged them under and kept them there so long. They bucked like bullheads. Mostly I went along with the hymn book. Someone pushed at me until he got to Ellen McGee, held her under and didn't stop, thinking maybe anything that pretty was bound for goings-on.
Goings-on.
I was ready for something like the cat I had tried to drown and failed, when up she came as sweet and stood for a spell at the edge of the tank, at home in the sky, and her gown, wet through, was true to her, and her face was where the sun had been.
Ooh, I love what's the line? The hands, repeat that line, hands were not meant for our pockets?
Right, they told us.
I love the rhythm of that one.
Our pockets were no place for hands, they said.
Our pockets were no place for hands. I love that.
Young boys should keep their hands on the table, right? right where you can see them, and wouldn't let us in the dark of the barn or anywhere God wouldn't be, etc.
So, seeing the way those words flow, it's clear to me you've never had writer's block.
I don't. I've had times when I haven't written a great deal,
okay,
which I view as very potential times, because that's when the well is filling, and that's where you can get other things done. That's when you can do your secretarial work. You can send out the poems, because when you're in the midst of writing them, you really don't want to think much about sending them out for publication. And I did that, and that was fun, because when they get out into the world, they have a life of their own, and then you hear from people, and then you find out what they're all about, because you didn't really know.
So when someone else reads them.
Yeah, then they tell you, oh, well, this poem's about such and such, and you say, ooh, well.
I didn't know that.
And who knows, what was coming up from underground. Because I do believe that, I'm not a mystic about it, but I think that poems come up from somewhere deep down the place of dreams, or the subconscious, or you can say we're channeling them through a divine source or whatever. I think that's kind of fluey, but they come up from the subconscious. They come up from places which are probably truer to our real way of thinking than our daily.
So writing is discovering those places.
It's a discovery.
Interesting.
And that's why the end. It's so fun to get to the end and be surprised yourself.
So you're telling writers that if they have writer's block, they should just go with it.
Yeah, not worry about it.
View
it as an adventure, a time when things are happening underground that you have no idea about.
Just let it
It's like a room tough, thing. The fruit is fermenting and bubbling away, and it needs that time to develop itself.
That's a different attitude towards writer's block. I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah, nothing to fear.
I want to shift gears and talk about the Sunken Garden Festival, because you were a founder. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my belief that poetry has to be heard, performed, to be really understood. You have, as with Shakespeare, you have to go to see the Tempest before you read it, or hopefully you do, because you understand it viscerally through your toes, up the body rather than from the head down.
Okay.
So I believed in the need for poetry to be heard, and therefore to be understood, and therefore to be loved. And I wanted it to be loved, and so many people don't love it, fear it, hate it.
Fear it, yes,
Perhaps
definitely.
were turned off in school by teachers who stressed, that you've got to understand what a synecdoche and a metonymy might be. They sound like pterodactyls, scary stuff. So when in 1992, the then director of the museum asked me if I thought poetry might thrive in the Sunken Garden at Hillstead Museum, which is a beautiful Beatrix Ferrand garden with stone walls and just a summer house in the middle, and I said, not just possible, but it will thrive here if we get the right advertising. And I knew that Larry Bloom at Northeast Magazine had a love of poetry, and the director and I went to him and said, Larry, what do you think? And he said, funny you should ask. And the rest is somewhat history, because it's still going on.
It's still going on.
25 years later. Yep.
You also do something that I think nurtures a different part of the brain, and that's mentoring young poets. Why?
Well, or mentoring beginning poets who might be in their 80s and 90s. I have a lot of nonagenarians
who are just writing poetry.
Well, they may have come into it in their 70s or whatever, but some people don't do it until they retire or until they have time. And Rilke said that you shouldn't try until you've developed a lifetime of experience.
Okay, yes, that makes sense.
Letters to a Young Poet, I think he wrote to that effect. And but I love working with beginning writers, young writers in particular, but all writers who are in the early stages. Because I believe that poetry is there in everybody, and it's just a question of somehow accessing it.
So discovering the poetry that's already
in
computers,
it's all there, or is in our brain. We remember our birth, but we probably have trouble accessing that.
Right.
But it's all there. And the sources of poems are there in spades for everybody. And of course for movies and novels and dance and all the other arts, film. So, but it's true of poetry, and so I like to both to relax them and say it's there, and furthermore, it's going to be joyful. It's going to be an adventure.
It's not going to be
You're going to love this, you know. I mean, and you're going to go on a trip, and you're not going to know where you're arriving, and you will have that joy of, you know, being in the middle of nowhere, but I'm loving it and getting somewhere.
Just going with it.
As I said before, shocks and surprises you. And then I give exercises like, you know, go back to your photographic album and, you know, just start flipping through who's there, what's there, what memories, what people, what what Edenic experiences.
Sounds like you're giving them permission to do
Permission.
this. So do some people fight against it? Do some people enjoy that? Or do they say thank you?
Well, they really say thank you. They wouldn't be there in the first place if they weren't willing to take a risk.
That's true.
But I say this isn't really a risk. This is a sure thing. It's not a question of if, but how and when. And it will happen now. It's not even a question of when. It's just a question of what's there, and how many wonderful things are there that will surprise you.
So it sounds like you enjoy the mentoring part.
Oh, yes.
Does that come into the book publishing part, or is that a different part of the brain?
I do that with my authors. They generally have already got a manuscript for me, but we work on perfecting it and sometimes creating new poems for it. And those poems come from that place that I've been talking about.
Right.
And I know I myself had a book, that had a missing link. It needed a poem about my early experience.
It needed a missing link?
It needed a poem to fill in a blank. I didn't have a poem about my very earliest years and my love of parents, in particular my mother. So I had to write a love poem for my mother. And I realized I commissioned myself.
You gave yourself an assignment.
Yeah, and it was all there. It wrote itself, and those are the best poems are the ones that do write themselves.
I like that expression. They wrote it. They
or do it in revision. Sometimes it doesn't come easily the first time through, but then when you go back to it, and sometimes start over or not, sometimes you get closer to what it was that was trying to well up in you that you perhaps squashed or didn't fully realize.
Well, when I write things, it's very common that when I go back the second time, I say to myself, read this not as an author, read this as someone reading it. Do you get it? Mm-hmm. And that helps with the revision.
Absolutely. When I had poems come back from the Atlantic Monthly with little American flags on the envelope like body bags, you know, I would put myself in the position of Peter Davison, who was the poetry editor, and think, oh, here's this poem that arrived on his desk, and he's opened it up and he's saying, oh God, another poem. Let's have a look at this. And I try to imagine, why did he say nope? And I put myself into I played that little game. I became Peter Davison. And, you know, lo and behold, because it probably had been, 4 or 5 months or something, some unconscionably long period of time before he replied, I can be objective. I'm seeing it as if somebody else wrote it, and now I'm seeing it as he looked at it. And it was amazing how I suddenly
how clear
could see
it becomes.
Clearly what needed to be.
I read that poetry has experienced some kind of a renaissance in the last couple of years. Are you seeing that?
Well, I am certainly in. Yes, I think so. There are so many poetry workshops, poetry readings, open mics. Rap, of course, has added a lot to it. There's a lot more going on in the schools. And some of it is teaching poetry correctly so that the students aren't afraid of it. There's a program called Poetry Out Loud, which starts with memorizing a poem. Okay. It starts with enjoying it, assimilating it, learning it from the inside out, from the toes up, and making it your own, which comes with memorizing, and learning how to speak it, how to perform it, how to sing it.
And that helps you write it?
It helps you understand it. It helps you appreciate it, because a lot of the joy of poetry is in the pure sound. Even a very intellectual poet, like Gerard Manley Hopkins, let's say, believed that poems have to be heard, have to be performed, have to be experienced viscerally to really be understood and enjoyed and experienced. So I think that is going on in the schools a great deal now, and it's making poetry accessible and fun. And then there are after-school programs cropping up, and all kinds of contests. The Hillstead runs one where the young poets are going to read in August, which is one of my favorite events at the Sunken Garden Festival. So yes, I think there is a renaissance. I think there's still a great fear of poetry abroad. It's still regarded as an un-American activity, I think.
Un-American.
Un-American. I mean, other countries don't have that hang-up. Even England. You can be a bestseller if you're Philip Larkin in England, and other countries even more so. Certain South America, all of the Russia, the Balkans, China, Japan. Poetry is like bread. It's
and
for
not
everyone.
so much here.
Not so much, although it's coming on. I think that in a sense, in the early days of Longfellow and even Robert Frost, that poetry was a popular art form. Longfellow sold more books than Robert Louis Stevenson or
really?
Sir Walter Scott or any of the other, Rudyard Kipling, any of the well-known authors. He was the best-selling worldwide author. And then it somehow went into a decline. Robert Frost made it popular again.
Yes.
And every doughboy carried a copy of Frost's poems to the battle front in the First World War. And then somehow the universities got a hold of it and strangled the life out of it and said, you've got to be smart to understand this. So we're going to get people like Helen
walled it
Bender
off from
and
people.
Harvard to explain to you what it all means. And so the New Yorker bought into that and began publishing this totally inscrutable stuff. Now I think there's a real battle between the academic world and the poetry underworld. For the soul, the heart and soul of poetry. And I hope the underworld is winning, although it's touch and go.
Before we go, since we were talking about the 60 over 60 Connecticut Awards, what did you think when you found out you were one of the winners?
Well, I thought, does that mean I'm sort of dead and they'll wheel me in? I'm on the far end of that after all. I'm in my 80s. So, but it was great fun. I met some wonderful people there. And Duncaster put on a wonderful festival of food and ideas, and
we're celebrating the fact that grown-ups can do many things.
Yeah, we had a great time. I read a poem as a benediction.
We loved that.
So it was a great experience.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Excellent.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.